At 2 in the morning on the 27th of April, 1865, the side-wheel steamboat Sultana was north of Memphis. It was fighting a swollen Mississippi River. Its decks were so crowded that many passengers had barely enough room to lie down. Then 3 of its 4 boilers exploded. The center of the boat broke open. The upper decks collapsed toward the furnaces. Fire spread through dry timber while hundreds of people entered a cold, fast river in darkness. By morning, the Sultana was gone. About 1,200 people died. Most were Union soldiers who had just survived Confederate prison camps and were finally going home. Its loss remains the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. Yet its name never became a permanent part of American memory. The reason is not that the evidence disappeared. There are inquiry reports, testimony, newspaper pages, and survivor accounts. There is even a photograph of the overloaded boat on its final full day. The central question is not simply why a boiler exploded. It is how roughly 2,100 people ended up on a steamboat licensed for 376 passengers. It is also how every warning passed through a system without stopping the voyage. Most of the people aboard were finally going home. They had been captured during the Civil War and held in camps including Andersonville, Georgia, and Cahaba, Alabama. By the spring of 1865, many had endured hunger, disease, exposure, and months of confinement. They reached Camp Fisk, outside Vicksburg, where the Union Army was trying to record, transport, and eventually discharge them. But the war was collapsing faster than the bureaucracy built to manage it. Confederate armies were surrendering. Prisoner exchanges were giving way to mass releases. Thousands of men who had waded through captivity now wanted only to move north. The government paid civilian steamboat operators to carry them. More passengers meant more revenue, and wartime rules allowed loads that ordinary civilian travel would not. That incentive did not by itself create the disaster. It made a dangerous decision easier to reward. This was not an improvised favor from one captain. The Army relied on commercial vessels and transport officers to convert human beings into manifests, receipts, and destinations. The system could move large numbers quickly when its estimates were sound. At Vicksburg, however, the people making the lists, assigning the boats, and supervising the landing did not share one reliable count. Urgency increased while information weakened. To understand how the boat became so crowded, follow the numbers. Captain Frederick Speed was helping process the released prisoners at Camp Fisk. Groups were organized, placed on trains, and carried into Vicksburg. The intended group sizes did not survive the rush. 3 trainloads went toward the Sultana, but in the confusion, Speed accounted for only 2. The first failure was arithmetic. Speed and other officers believed the boat was taking something like 1,300 or 1,400 soldiers. The official inquiry later counted 1,866 troops before adding civilian passengers and crew. No responsible officer inspected the Sultana to decide how many people it could safely carry. No one inspected its physical condition on behalf of the men being sent aboard. And other steamers were at the landing capable of taking part of the group. That last fact removes the easiest excuse. The choice was not between the Sultana and leaving the prisoners stranded indefinitely. Space existed on other boats. The real failure was that authority had become fragmented. One office released the men, another arranged transport, another managed the landing, while senior commanders assumed the operation below them was under control. The inquiry rejected a story that the soldiers demanded to remain together. They were eager to leave, but officials, not the former prisoners, controlled the transportation. Putting all 1,866 troops on one boat was, in the inquiry's language, unnecessary and unjustifiable. The crowd became its own visible warning. Men occupied the lower deck, the cabin deck, and the upper hurricane deck. Sleeping space almost vanished. Movement after dark would be nearly impossible. The upper deck began to sag, so temporary posts were added beneath it. The legal capacity mattered for more than comfort. Life-saving equipment, cooking space, access routes, and the crew's ability to respond were designed around a far smaller passenger load. The Sultana could remain afloat under the weight and still be catastrophically unsafe. That difference between carrying weight and carrying people safely would later help responsibility slip away. And below those crowded decks, a second problem was already being repaired. One of the Sultana's 4 interconnected boilers had developed a leak before the boat reached Vicksburg. A boilermaker installed a riveted patch. The chief engineer later testified that he considered the repair sound. The official inquiry was less confident. It described replacing adjoining boiler sheets as the permanent repair and the patch as an imperfect substitute. This distinction matters. The patch is often presented as the single doomed decision, but the surviving evidence does not prove that the patch itself tore first. It proves something narrower and still alarming: a boat with a known boiler problem received a limited repair while an enormous crowd was being placed above it. Rumors of bribery soon surrounded the loading. Per passenger payments created an obvious financial temptation, and different officials accused one another. But the official record said the accusations lacked proof. A secret cash exchange makes a clean villain story. The evidence supports a messier failure of incentives, haste, and authority. The boat left Vicksburg just after 9 that night. For more than a day, it moved north through cold rain and a river running high with spring floodwater. At Helena, Arkansas, a photographer made the most important surviving image of the voyage. The Sultana appears almost hidden by people. Soldiers line the rails, fill the decks, and cover the roof around the pilot house. But the photograph was not the warning. It was a record of warnings already ignored. The impossible count, the unused boats, the sagging deck, the unperformed inspection, and the boiler repair below. The Sultana reached Memphis on the evening of the 26th of April. Cargo was unloaded. Coal was taken aboard near the city. Then the steamboat resumed its fight upstream against the flood current. Roughly an hour later, the voyage ended. The explosion happened at about 2 in the morning. 3 boilers ruptured in rapid succession, tearing through the center of the vessel. The smokestacks lost their support. Decks that had been carrying tightly packed passengers fell into the opening. Burning material reached the wooden superstructure, and the wreck began to drift. For survivors, the danger kept changing. Some were injured by the blast or trapped by collapsed timber. Others moved toward the ends of the boat as fire consumed the middle. As parts of the paddle wheel structure broke away, the wreck turned in the current, and the wind drove flames toward people who had believed they were temporarily safe. The alternative was the Mississippi. It was dark, cold, broad with floodwater, and moving quickly. Many of the former prisoners were already physically weakened. Some held planks, doors, pieces of railing, or anything else that floated. Others reached trees standing in flooded ground. Passing boats and people along the river began pulling survivors from the water. The Bostona No. 2 reached the burning wreck and carried word toward Memphis. More vessels joined the search as people drifted downstream. The rescue continued into daylight while the remains of the Sultana burned and finally sank. Hundreds of survivors were taken to hospitals and the soldiers' home in Memphis. Some had lost every possession. Others still had to complete the journey that the Sultana had interrupted, north by another boat, then by rail, then finally toward their families. The disaster did not end at the waterline. Communities waited for names that the Army could not immediately confirm. Even the death toll became difficult to stabilize. The Army's boarding records were incomplete. Civilian passengers, crew, guards, and soldiers were counted differently. Newspapers published changing estimates as survivor lists arrived. An official inquiry calculated 1,238 deaths. Later accounts often raised the number above 1,500. The best modern name-by-name reconstruction lowers it to 1,169, still about 1,200 lives, and still the deadliest maritime disaster in the country. Modern reconstruction also places about 2,137 passengers and crew aboard. Another careful historical count reached 2,222. The difference is not carelessness by modern researchers. It reflects the damaged foundation they inherited: duplicated names, men who boarded without appearing on the right roll, people assigned to the boat who may not have sailed, and bodies the river never returned. The correction does not make the tragedy smaller. It makes the story more accurate. The scale was enormous precisely because the passengers had not been properly counted while they were alive. Then came the search for a cause. One military report concluded that low water and defective, imperfectly repaired boilers produced the explosion. Another senior investigator refused to name a precise mechanism before the wrecked boilers could be examined. He noted testimony that the boilers contained water and found no evidence that the boat was leaning at the critical moment. Later theories blamed the patch, sediment inside the boilers, the boat's side-to-side motion, or a deliberate explosive disguised as coal. The sabotage story is dramatic, but it has no physical or corroborating evidence. Modern engineers also dispute the familiar claim that simple careening explains everything. The honest conclusion is limited. The boilers failed. A leak and repair were documented. Heavy current, high steam demand, boiler design, maintenance, water level, and metal condition all belong in the technical investigation. But the exact first rupture cannot now be recovered with certainty. That uncertainty does not erase responsibility for the conditions around it. No single mistake created the Sultana disaster. A hurried demobilization produced thousands of vulnerable passengers. A payment system rewarded fuller boats. Bad counts concealed the true load. Available vessels went unused. Officers failed to inspect capacity or condition. A known boiler problem received a repair whose adequacy was disputed. Each failure left the next one room to matter. The investigations recognized much of this chain. Brigadier General William Hoffman censured 4 officers and judged Colonel Reuben Hatch and Captain Speed most responsible for the overcrowding. But the inquiries divided mechanical responsibility from administrative responsibility, and the legal case narrowed further. Only Speed was court-martialed. He was convicted of neglect connected to the overloading, but the Army's Judge Advocate General later reversed the verdict. Important witnesses, including Hatch, had left military service and could ignore military subpoenas. Captain James Cass Mason and several members of the boat's leadership died in the disaster. The reversal turned on a distinction that was legally useful and historically revealing. The Sultana had not sunk because passenger weight pushed it beneath the surface. It had stayed afloat until the boilers failed. Overcrowding and explosion could therefore be treated as separate issues. In lived reality, they were inseparable. The crowd magnified every consequence and made escape, firefighting, and rescue far harder. In the end, no person carried final legal responsibility for roughly 1,200 deaths. America's deadliest maritime disaster was not one inexplicable accident. It was a sequence of documented choices whose consequences arrived together, followed by investigations that separated those choices until accountability dissolved between them. There is one last reason the Sultana faded. The timing was almost designed to erase it from national attention. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated less than 2 weeks earlier. His funeral train was moving across the country. John Wilkes Booth was killed on the 26th of April, the day before the disaster. Confederate armies were still surrendering as the Civil War ended. The Sultana was reported. But it entered newspapers already crowded with the murder of a president, the hunt for his assassin, national mourning, and the collapse of a 4-year war. The victims came largely from Midwestern and border state regiments. Their deaths spread into hundreds of local communities instead of becoming one lasting national symbol. The uncertainty helped the forgetting. There was no clean passenger list, no single accepted death toll, no definitive mechanical answer, and no convicted official around whom the story could organize itself. Even the wreck disappeared when the Mississippi changed course, leaving its remains beneath Arkansas soil far from the modern river. What remains is the photograph at Helena. Look past the scale of the crowd and it becomes a picture of institutional failure before the final event. Every person visible is already inside a chain that no one person claims to control. That is the lasting warning. Catastrophes do not always begin with one monstrous decision. Sometimes they are assembled from ordinary permissions, one more group, one more shortcut, one more assumption that somebody else has checked. The Sultana carried men who had survived the war to the edge of home. Their final voyage became a disaster not because nobody could see the danger, but because responsibility was divided among people who each saw only part of it. That is why the Sultana still matters.